She was 48 years old, standing at the edge of a wedding reception dance floor, when a man she'd never met asked her to dance and changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that exact moment, because you need to feel what Rebecca Hartley felt when her carefully invisible life shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The champagne glass was heavy in her hand, heavier than it should be. Or maybe it was just that her arm was tired from holding it for the past hour, clutching it like a shield against the couples, swaying on the dance floor. The DJ was playing something slow and romantic, and Becca to the few people who still called her anything, watched her daughter Emma spin in her new husband's arms. Emma's wedding dress caught the light from the chandeliers overhead, scattering tiny rainbows across the polished floor, and God, she was beautiful. 26 years old and radiant in a way that made Becca's chest ache. David held Emma like she was made of something precious, and Becca knew that look. She'd seen it before, 14 years ago, on Marcus's face every time he looked at her. Before the heart attack, before the debt, before she became the woman standing alone at the edge of someone else's happiness. Her feet were screaming. She'd forgotten what heels felt like, these navy pumps she bought at a discount store 3 days before the wedding because everything else in her closet was practical flats for running between her day job and her night shifts at the restaurant. The shoes pinched her toes and rubbed blisters on her heels, but she smiled through it because that's what mothers do. They smile through everything. The ache in her feet, the exhaustion in her bones, the loneliness that wrapped around her ribs and squeezed every time she saw Emma look at her with that mixture of love and worry, like a daughter who knew her mother was drowning but didn't know how to throw a rope. Laughter rippled through the reception hall. Someone's uncle was doing an elaborate dance move that involved far too much hip action for a man his age. People clapped and cheered. Becca lifted her champagne to her lips but didn't drink. She'd been nursing the same glass all evening, letting the bubbles go flat, because drinking alone felt too obvious, too pathetic. She was already the only single mother in a room full of intact families. She didn't need to be the drunk one, too. At least Emma found someone. The voice came from her left, dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made Becca's jaw tighten. Natalie. Her older sister materialized beside her like an expensive perfume, Chanel in judgment. Natalie's husband Trevor trailed behind her, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. I was worried she'd end up alone like you. The words landed like a slap. Clean. Efficient. Designed to wound without leaving visible marks. Becca turned to face her sister, keeping her expression carefully neutral. Natalie looked perfect, as always. Blonde hair swept into an elegant updo. A navy dress that probably cost more than Becca made in 2 weeks. Pearls at her throat that their mother had given her because Natalie was the successful one, the married one, the one who'd done everything right. Emma's happy, Becca said quietly. That's all that matters. Natalie's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course. You did a wonderful job raising her. All by yourself. With those 2 jobs. She said it like a compliment, but Becca heard the subtext. Poor Becca. Tragic Becca. Becca who couldn't keep her husband alive or find another one to replace him. Trevor shifted his weight, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The wedding's lovely, he offered weakly. It is, Becca agreed, because it was true. Emma and David had planned something simple but beautiful. White roses and string lights. Close friends and family. The kind of wedding Becca herself had once dreamed of, back when she was 19 and thought she had forever with Marcus. Back before she learned that forever could end at 42 with a heart attack in a grocery store parking lot, leaving her alone with a 12-year-old daughter and $47,000 in debt. Natalie was still talking. Something about Trevor's promotion, their vacation home in the Hamptons, how they were thinking of getting a second dog because the first one was lonely. Becca nodded in the right places, made appropriate sounds, and felt herself disappearing. That was her talent, really. The ability to stand in a room full of people and become invisible. The mother who'd worked 2 jobs for 14 years. The administrative assistant by day, the restaurant server by night. The woman who'd put her daughter through college and shown up to exactly 0 parent-teacher conferences because she was always working. The woman who'd sacrificed so much that there was nothing left of her to see. She was proud. God, she was so proud of Emma. But standing here in her discount shoes with her flat champagne and her sister's pity, Becca felt the weight of every choice she'd made. Every missed school play. Every birthday cake from a grocery store because she didn't have time to bake. Every time Emma had come home to an empty house because her mother was keeping them afloat. "Excuse me," Becca said, cutting off Natalie mid-sentence about their upcoming cruise. "I need to use the restroom." She didn't wait for a response. Just turned and headed for the doors at the back of the reception hall, weaving through clusters of celebrating guests. She needed 5 minutes. 5 minutes to compose herself, to remember how to breathe, to put her mask back on. But before she could escape, a hand touched her elbow. Gentle. Warm. She stopped, turned, and found herself looking up at a man she'd never seen before. He was tall. Silver hair that caught the light. Maybe 50, maybe older. It was hard to tell. He wore his age well, carried it with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. His suit was expensive. She'd learned to recognize quality fabric from years of serving wealthy customers at the restaurant, and his gray eyes held something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Interest. Not pity. Not sympathy. Just pure, genuine interest. "I believe we haven't met," he said, and his voice was deep, textured like good whiskey. "Julian Westbrook. My brother Rick was David's college roommate." Becca blinked. Tried to place him. She'd met David's family, his friends, but there were so many people at this wedding. "Rebecca Hartley," she managed. "Emma's mother." "I know." His smile was slight but real. "I've been watching you." The words should have sounded creepy, should have sent warning signals through her exhausted brain. Instead, they sounded honest, like he was simply stating a fact. "That's either very romantic or very concerning," Becca said, surprising herself with the attempt at humor. Julian laughed. A real laugh, not the polite chuckle people gave when they were trying to be nice. "Fair point. Let me rephrase. I've been watching you stand alone for the past hour while everyone else dances, and I thought perhaps you might like to change that." He extended his hand. Not demanding. Not assuming. Just offering. "I don't really dance," Becca heard herself say, even though that wasn't true. She and Marcus used to dance in their kitchen at midnight, bare feet on cold tile, moving to music only they could hear. "Neither do I," Julian said. "But I'm willing to make an exception if you are." Something in his voice suggested he wouldn't take no for an answer. Or maybe it was something in her own chest, something that had been silent for so long she'd forgotten it could speak. That tiny voice that whispered, "What if?" "Okay," she said. "One dance." His hand was warm when she took it. Steady. He led her onto the dance floor as the DJ started a new song, something slow and sweet that she didn't recognize. Other couples moved around them, lost in their own worlds. Julian's hand settled on her waist, respectful but firm, and Becca realized with a jolt that she couldn't remember the last time a man had touched her. Not like this. Not like she was something worth holding. They moved together, finding a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He didn't try to impress her with complicated steps. Just a simple sway, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something cedar and expensive, and see the fine lines around his eyes. Then he spoke, and the question cut straight through every defense she'd built. "What's the story behind those eyes? You look like someone who's been carrying the world alone." The directness of it nearly broke her. She'd spent 14 years making sure no one looked too closely, making sure no one asked questions that might unravel her careful composure. And here was this stranger, this man she'd known for 30 seconds, seeing straight through her. She deflected with humor, because that's what invisible people do. "Is that your pickup line? It needs work." But Julian didn't back down. He just laughed, warm and genuine. "I'm told I'm direct. But I meant it. You looked like you needed someone to ask." Becca felt something shift in her chest. A crack in the armor she'd welded shut. "And you're someone who asks. When it matters," he said simply. They danced in silence for a moment, and Becca was acutely aware of Natalie watching from the sidelines, leaning close to whisper to another guest. She could imagine what her sister was saying. Who is that man? Why is he dancing with Becca? Doesn't he know she's just the struggling widow? Julian pulled her slightly closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I'm going to tell you something that might sound crazy." Becca's heart picked up speed. This was it. The moment where he revealed he was selling insurance or looking for his next charity case. The moment where the small spark of hope she'd allowed herself would get snuffed out. What? I came to this wedding as a favor to my brother. I was planning to leave after the ceremony. I have a meeting in the morning. A flight to catch. He paused, and his gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. But then I saw you standing there, watching your daughter with this look of fierce love and quiet grief, and I thought, I want to know that woman's story. Becca didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This couldn't be real. Men like this, men who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, men who smelled expensive and moved with confidence, didn't notice women like her. Women with discount shoes and flat champagne and 14 years of exhaustion written in the lines around their eyes. What makes you think I have a story worth knowing? She asked, and hated how her voice shook on the last word. Julian's answer stopped her breath completely. Because I recognize someone who's been invisible for too long. I was invisible once too. Before I built my company, before the money, I was just the poor kid everyone overlooked. And I know that look, that feeling of being in a room full of people and knowing that not one of them really sees you. The song ended. Other couples began to separate, heading back to their tables or toward the bar. But Julian didn't let go of her hand, didn't step away. He just stood there on the dance floor, holding her gaze like she was the only person in the room. Dance with me again, he said. Not a question. A request that felt like a lifeline. And this time, tell me something true. Becca's mind raced. Who was this man? This Julian Westbrook who appeared out of nowhere and saw things no one else bothered to look for? And why did she feel like her carefully constructed life, her invisible, manageable, safe life, was about to come completely undone? The DJ started another song. Julian was waiting. And Rebecca Hartley, 48 years old and invisible for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, had a choice to make. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered if your story matters, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next will prove that you are never too old, too tired, or too ordinary for magic. And if you don't subscribe, well, come tell me in the comments why you're choosing to miss out. I'll wait. But before I tell you what Rebecca said to Julian Westbrook on that dance floor, before I show you how one conversation can crack open a life you thought was sealed shut, you need to understand how she became invisible in the first place. Because nobody just disappears. It happens slowly, one sacrifice at a time, one choice that feels necessary until you look up and realize you don't recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. 14 years earlier, Rebecca Hartley sat in a hospital waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and despair. She was 34 years old, and her husband was dead. The words didn't make sense yet. They hung in the air like a foreign language she hadn't learned to speak. Marcus, dead. Heart attack. 42 years old. The doctor had said other things too. Words like massive and couldn't have known, and nothing anyone could have done, but Becca couldn't hold on to them. They slipped through her mind like water through a sieve. What she could hold was Emma's hand. 12 years old. Small and cold and trembling. Emma hadn't cried yet either. They sat there together in matching states of shock, listening to monitors beep in other rooms, listening to other families receive other news. Good news, probably. Babies being born. Tests coming back clean. Normal things happening to normal people. But not them. Not anymore. Becca kept thinking she should cry. Should feel something other than this terrible numbness that wrapped around her chest like ice. But the tears wouldn't come. Because if she started crying, she might never stop. And Emma needed her. Emma needed her to be strong. So Becca swallowed the scream building in her throat and squeezed her daughter's hand and thought, okay. Survival mode. We're in survival mode now. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, and Natalie's voice cutting through the fog like a knife. Her sister had flown in from Connecticut, all perfectly styled sympathy and designer black dress. She pulled Becca aside after the service, in front of the reception table with its ham sandwiches and potato salad that nobody was eating, and said, "You should have made him get more life insurance. What are you going to do now?" Like it was Becca's fault. Like she'd failed some basic test of adulthood by not anticipating that her healthy 42-year-old husband would drop dead in a grocery store parking lot. Becca had $47,000 in debt. The mortgage. Emma to raise alone. And then Marcus's business partner, the one who'd always seemed so friendly, so trustworthy, disappeared with most of the company's liquid assets. Just vanished. Took the money and ran, leaving Becca with legal bills she couldn't afford and an insurance payout that wouldn't begin to cover what they'd lost. Friends promised to help, brought more casseroles, said, "Call me if you need anything," with their hands on their hearts. But within 6 months, the calls stopped coming. The invitations dried up, because grief is exhausting for everyone, and Becca was too much need and not enough fun. She understood. She really did. But understanding didn't make her any less alone. 6 months after Marcus died, Becca was working 2 jobs. Administrative assistant during the day, answering phones and filing paperwork and smiling at people who had no idea her life was falling apart. Restaurant server at night, carrying plates and taking orders and pretending her feet didn't hurt and her back didn't ache and her heart wasn't broken into so many pieces she'd never find them all. Emma came home to an empty house most days. Let herself in with the key Becca had strung on a chain around her neck. Did her homework alone at the kitchen table. Made herself dinner from whatever Becca had managed to grab at the grocery store. Becca would stumble through the door around 11, exhausted and smelling like other people's food, and find Emma already in bed. They'd exchange a few words. "How was school?" "Fine." "Did you eat?" "Yes." "Do you need anything?" "No. Mom, I'm okay." But Emma wasn't okay. None of them were okay. Becca watched her 12-year-old daughter become self-sufficient years too early, watched her stop asking for help because help wasn't available, watched their relationship shift from mother and child to something more like partners in survival. Becca missed every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered because she was working, always working, trying to keep them from drowning in debt. Years passed in a painful montage of exhaustion. Emma at 15, quiet and distant, more comfortable with silence than conversation. Emma at 18, opening the acceptance letter to college on a full scholarship, and Becca crying for the first time in years because at least something had gone right. Becca was proud, so impossibly proud, but she also realized with a sinking horror that she'd been so focused on survival, she'd forgotten how to live. Her friends from her married life had vanished completely. She was the awkward single woman at couples' dinners, the reminder that marriages end and happiness is fragile. She tried dating a few times, met men through apps or set up attempts from well-meaning coworkers. But they either wanted a mother figure for their own kids or were intimidated by her strength, her independence, her refusal to play helpless. After a while, she stopped trying. It was easier to be alone than to be constantly disappointed. Easier to work and sleep and work again than to hope for something more. Then, just months before the wedding, Emma called with news that made Becca's heart soar and sink simultaneously. She was engaged. To David, who Becca had met exactly twice. The realization hit her like cold water. She'd been so absent, so focused on survival, that her daughter's life had happened without her. Emma reassured her over the phone, her voice warm and certain. "Mom, you gave me everything. You showed me what strength looks like." But Becca felt like a fraud. She hadn't shown Emma strength. She'd shown her how to disappear, how to become so small and so quiet that nobody noticed when you were struggling. Wedding planning began, and Becca found herself participating in this joyful ritual while feeling like an imposter in her own daughter's life. She didn't know who she was anymore beyond Emma's mom and the widow who never recovered. She'd worked herself into obscurity, into invisibility, into a shadow of who she'd been at 34 with her whole life ahead of her. But that night at the wedding, Julian Westbrook looked at her like she was someone. Like she mattered. Like she was visible. And for the first time in 14 years, Rebecca wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was still time to find herself again. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller if you know what it's like to lose yourself while saving someone else. And for those not subscribing, drop a comment explaining how you're okay with missing the most beautiful love story you'll hear this year. So there they were, back on the dance floor for the second song, and this time something was different. Julian Westbrook held Rebecca a little closer, moved with her a little slower, and asked the kinds of questions that people usually avoid at weddings. He didn't ask about the weather or the food, or how beautiful the bride looked. He asked about her life. Really asked. Not the polite surface questions that people throw out when they're making conversation they don't intend to remember. He wanted to know about Marcus, about the years after, about what it felt like to work 2 jobs while watching her daughter grow up from a distance. And here's the thing that shocked Becca more than anything else that night. She told him the truth. Not the sanitized version she gave to acquaintances. Not the brave face she showed Emma. The actual truth about becoming invisible, about sacrificing so much of herself that she sometimes couldn't remember who she'd been before the survival began. Julian didn't interrupt. Didn't offer platitudes about how strong she must be or how Emma was lucky to have her. He just nodded like he understood, like he lived in that same space where you work so hard to keep everyone else afloat that you forget you're drowning too. Then Julian told her his story, and Becca realized this man in his expensive suit with his silver hair and confident bearing had started from a place even harder than hers. He grew up poor in rural Pennsylvania. Coal miner's son. The kind of poor where winter meant choosing between heat and food, where college was a fantasy for other people's children. His father died in a mine collapse when Julian was 16. Just gone. One day a father, the next day a memory, and a funeral bill they couldn't afford. Julian became the man of the house overnight. Took care of his mother and younger brother. Worked construction during the day, studied at night, clawed his way through community college, and then engineering school on scholarships and spite. Built a tech company from absolutely nothing. And now, at 52, he was worth $2.3 billion. Billion. With A-B. But here's what he said next, and Becca felt it land in her chest like a stone. Success came at a cost. His marriage failed. His children were estranged. He'd worked so hard to build something that would prove he wasn't that poor kid from Pennsylvania that he forgot to actually live. Forgot to be present for the people who mattered. By the time he realized what he'd lost, his kids were grown and wanted nothing to do with him. "I'm 52 years old," Julian said, his voice quiet enough that Becca had to lean in to hear him over the music, "and I have everything money can buy. But I can't remember the last time I felt seen. Really seen. Not as the tech billionaire or the success story or the guy who can write a check. Just as Julian, the person underneath all of it." And Becca understood in that moment why this man had crossed a crowded wedding reception to dance with a stranger. They were kindred spirits. Both had disappeared into survival. Both had worked themselves into invisibility, just in different directions. He asked her about her dreams, about what she'd wanted before life happened, and everything became about just getting through the day. Becca heard herself admitting things she hadn't said out loud in years. That she wanted to teach. Maybe write. That she'd been an English major before she dropped out when Emma was born, before the practical needs of life crushed the impractical dreams of who she might have been. "It's too late now," she said, and hated how defeated she sounded. "I'm 48. Life happened." Julian's response was immediate and hit her like a shock. "Is it? Or did you just convince yourself you don't deserve more?" The question hung between them, sharp and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. The wedding reception continued around them like they were in a bubble. Emma danced past with David, and Becca saw her daughter's face light up when she noticed her mother laughing with this stranger. Real laughter. The kind Becca couldn't remember producing in years. But across the room, Natalie was watching with pursed lips, leaning close to whisper something to Trevor that made him look uncomfortable. Julian seemed oblivious to all of it. He was focused entirely on Becca, like she was the only person in the room worth his attention. Then he asked her to dinner. The next night, just the two of them. And Becca felt panic rise in her throat, because this man was a billionaire and she was a woman who worked 2 jobs and shopped at Goodwill. "I can't," she started, already forming the gentle rejection that would let them both save face. But Julian interrupted her, and what he said next changed everything. "Before you say no, let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who sacrificed everything for her daughter, who worked 2 jobs and never complained, who became invisible because she thought love meant erasing herself. I see someone remarkable trying to convince herself she's ordinary." Becca's eyes welled up, and she didn't even care that her mascara would run or that people might notice. When was the last time anyone had really seen her? Not pitied her, not felt sorry for her, but actually seen her worth? "One dinner," Julian pressed, his hand warm on her waist. "If it's terrible, we never speak again. But if it's good, we see where it goes." Becca took a breath and made a decision that would change everything. "Okay, one dinner. The song ended. Julian escorted her back to her table like she was something precious. But as he walked away, Natalie pounced. "Do you know who that man is?" "Julian Westbrook. His company built half the internet infrastructure in America. What could he possibly want with you?" And there it was, the question that would haunt Becca all night. What could he possibly want? Was this real? Or was she being foolish, letting herself hope for something that would only break her heart again? Hit subscribe if you're rooting for Becca, because she's about to discover she's worth so much more than she ever imagined. Not subscribing? Tell me in the comments if you think she should run away or take the chance. I need to know what you think. The next evening, Becca stood in her small apartment staring at a closet full of clothes that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Work pants, restaurant uniforms, a few faded t-shirts. Nothing that said, "Dinner with a billionaire." Nothing that said, "Woman who deserves to be seen." Her apartment was 900 square feet of carefully maintained order, the kind of space where everything had to have a purpose because there wasn't room for excess. She'd lived here for 12 years, ever since she downsized from the house she'd shared with Marcus, the house with the mortgage she couldn't afford and the memories in every corner that made it impossible to breathe. Now she stood in front of her open closet feeling like a teenager before prom, except she was 48 and terrified. Her phone rang. Emma, staying with David's family for the weekend, but somehow sensing her mother's panic across the miles. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound weird." Becca almost lied. Almost said everything was fine. But the truth came out in a rush. "I have nothing to wear. I don't know what I'm doing. This man is a billionaire, Emma. A billionaire. And I'm going to show up looking like exactly what I am." Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "Mom, he asked you out because he likes you. Not some version of you. You. Wear something that makes you feel confident and stop overthinking this." Becca's eyes landed on a simple black dress pushed to the back of her closet. She'd worn it to Marcus's funeral and never touched it again. It felt strange pulling it on for a happy occasion, like she was crossing some invisible threshold. Like she was finally giving herself permission to live again instead of just surviving. Julian picked her up in a Tesla, sleek and silent, but he opened the door himself. No driver, no entourage, just him in dark jeans and a button-down shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent but somehow didn't look pretentious. He took her to an intimate Italian restaurant tucked into a side street in the West Village, the kind of place with maybe 15 tables and soft lighting and waiters who move like dancers. Not a flashy mansion, not some scene designed to impress, just a place where two people could talk. And talk they did. Over wine that tasted like liquid gold and pasta that melted on her tongue, the conversation flowed with an ease that shocked Becca. He asked about her dreams. Not the practical ones about paying bills and keeping Emma fed. The real dreams. Teaching. Writing. Traveling to places she'd only seen in books. She asked about his work, and he lit up talking about building technology that connected people, about solving problems that mattered, about using money to make actual change instead of just accumulating more of it. There was no pretense, no games, no feeling like she had to be anyone other than exactly who she was. For the first time in 14 years, Becca felt like she was on a date with someone who actually wanted to know her, not fix her or pity her or use her to fill some empty space in their own life. Then Becca admitted something that made her voice shake. "I don't know how to do this. Date, I mean. I was with Marcus since I was 19. And since he died, I've been in survival mode. I don't know how to be anything else." Julian set down his wine glass and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts vulnerable and honest. "I haven't dated in 3 years. After the divorce, I threw myself into work. It was easier than risking more failure." Then he shared something that clearly cost him to say. His children from his first marriage barely spoke to him. His daughter Sophia was 28, his son Marcus was 25, and both of them resented his absence during their childhood. He'd been there physically sometimes, but never emotionally, always on his phone, always checking emails, always building the empire that would prove he was worth something. "I built an empire," he said quietly, staring into his wine like it held answers. "But I lost my family. You did the opposite. You sacrificed the empire to keep your family." He looked up at her then, and his gray eyes were raw with something Becca recognized. "Regret. Neither of us got the balance right. Maybe we could help each other find it." Dinner stretched into hours. They talked until the restaurant was empty, and the waiters were politely stacking chairs. Julian walked her to his car, and under the glow of street lights, he asked to see her again. Becca said yes, but felt compelled to voice the insecurity that had been building all night. I need to be honest with you. I work 2 jobs. I live in a 900-square-foot apartment. I shop at discount stores. Our lives are completely different. I don't want you to think I'm something I'm not. Julian's response was immediate, and so sincere it made her chest ache. Good. Because I'm tired of people who only see my money. You see me. That's rarer than you think. He kissed her cheek, gentle and respectful, his lips barely brushing her skin but the touch electric enough to make her breath catch. He promised to call tomorrow. And he did. Over the next 3 months, their relationship grew in ways that felt both natural and surreal. Julian attended Emma and David's newlywed dinners, charming everyone with stories that made him seem less like a tech mogul and more like a regular person who'd gotten lucky. Becca met Julian's brother Rick and his family, and they welcomed her with such genuine warmth that she almost cried. But not everything was easy. Natalie grew more critical, spreading gossip to anyone who would listen that Becca was obviously a gold digger, that this would end badly, that Julian would tire of playing savior to a working-class widow. Old friends from Becca's married life suddenly resurfaced, friends who'd ghosted her years ago but now wanted to reconnect, and she could see the calculation in their eyes every time Julian's name came up. Becca felt torn between 2 worlds. The relationship felt real when it was just her and Julian, but the outside world treated it like a fairy tale that couldn't possibly last. Julian introduced her to his company executives at a casual lunch, and while they were respectful, she could see the skepticism. Then Julian did something that made Becca's stomach drop. He asked her to attend a charity gala as his date. A public debut. His world would see them together, and there would be cameras and society pages and judgment. Becca panicked. She'd be criticized, called an opportunist, torn apart by people who had no idea who she was. But Emma, wise beyond her years, told her mother what she needed to hear. Mom, you've spent 14 years being invisible. Maybe it's time to be seen. So Becca said yes to the gala, not knowing that the evening would change everything. Just not in the way she expected. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller before we get to the gala, because what happens there will leave you speechless. And if you're not subscribing, comment below and tell me why you're comfortable missing the most jaw-dropping moment of this story. I'll be reading every comment. The charity gala was being held at one of those luxury hotels in Manhattan where even the air feels expensive. Becca stood in front of the mirror in a borrowed designer gown that Emma had insisted they shop for together. A floor-length emerald number that cost more than Becca made in 2 months, but that Emma had said made her mother look like royalty. Becca didn't feel like royalty. She felt like an imposter. Like someone who'd borrowed a costume for a play she hadn't auditioned for and didn't know the lines to. But Julian was waiting downstairs, and when she descended the grand staircase and saw his face light up, some of the fear loosened its grip on her chest. He looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, and for a moment, she almost believed she belonged here. They entered the ballroom together, Julian's hand warm and steady on her back, and cameras flashed like lightning. She could hear the whispers immediately, could feel the assessment happening from every corner of the room. Who is she? Where did he find her? Is she age-appropriate? That last one stung more than Becca wanted to admit. Because yes, she was 48 to Julian's 52, but something about the way the woman said it made it clear she thought Becca was too old, too worn, too ordinary to be on Julian Westbrook's arm. Julian introduced her to everyone. Business partners in expensive suits who shook her hand and looked through her like she was glass. Donors who smiled politely and then turned their attention immediately back to Julian. Old friends who assessed her worth in the time it took to say hello and clearly found her wanting. And then she met Victoria Westbrook, Julian's ex-wife. Becca had known this moment was coming, had prepared herself for it, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of Victoria. She was everything Becca wasn't. Tall, blonde, elegant in a way that looked effortless but probably required a team of professionals. She moved through the gala like she owned it, and when Julian introduced them, her smile was cordial but her eyes were ice. Julian has interesting taste, Victoria said, her voice smooth and cultured. I do hope this works out better than our marriage. The implication was clear. Becca was temporary, a rebound, not built for this world. She'd be gone soon enough, and Victoria would still be here, still part of Julian's universe in ways Becca never could be. Julian squeezed Becca's hand, a silent gesture of support, but Victoria had already moved on, gliding away to another conversation like she'd just swatted a fly. About halfway through the evening, Julian was pulled away by a major donor who wanted to discuss some tech initiative, and Becca found herself alone at the bar. She ordered water because champagne on an empty stomach felt dangerous, and that's when they descended. A group of women, all Victoria's age and clearly Victoria's friends, approached with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They surrounded her like sharks circling wounded prey. "So," one of them said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "where did you go to school?" Becca told them the truth. Community college. Dropped out after 2 years when Emma was born. The women exchanged glances. "And what do you do?" another asked. Becca could have lied, could have made herself sound more impressive, but she promised herself she wouldn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. "I work 2 jobs," she said. Administrative assistant during the day, restaurant server at night. The disdain was palpable. They didn't even try to hide it. One woman, the one with the pearl necklace that probably cost more than Becca's car, leaned in with a smile that was pure poison. How refreshing! Julian found someone so grounded, someone so real. "I'm sure it won't last, but good for you for trying." The other women laughed, light tinkling sounds that felt like knives. Becca stood there feeling the humiliation rise in her throat like bile. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe this whole thing was just a fantasy that would crumble the moment Julian realized she couldn't navigate his world. Becca excused herself and practically ran to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall and fought tears that threatened to ruin the makeup Emma had so carefully applied. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called her daughter. Emma answered on the second ring, heard the tremor in her mother's voice, and immediately knew something was wrong. Becca admitted she felt like a fraud, that these people could see right through her, that maybe Natalie and Victoria and all those awful women were right. Emma's response was fierce and immediate. "Mom, those people are intimidated by you. You earned everything you have. They inherited it or married into it. You're the real thing. They're the imposters." The words hit Becca like cold water, shocking and clarifying. She took a breath, fixed her makeup, and walked back into that ballroom with her head high. She found Julian in conversation with an older couple, and when he saw her, his face relaxed with relief. "There you are," he said, pulling her close. "I want you to meet my parents." And Becca found herself face to face with James and Helen Westbrook. Warm, kind, working-class retirees from Pennsylvania who looked nothing like the people in this ballroom. James had been a coal miner who survived the same collapse that killed his colleague and Julian's father. Helen had been a schoolteacher. They embraced Becca like she was already family, and Helen said with tears in her eyes, "Julian told us he met someone remarkable. Now we see why." As the evening wound down, the charity auction began. Becca watched as lots went for thousands, tens of thousands, amounts of money that made her head spin. Then came a lot that made the room go quiet. Dinner with tech visionary and partner. Julian's hand shot up. $500,000, he said, his voice clear and certain. The room gasped. The auctioneer stuttered. Someone else tried to bid higher, but Julian topped it. When the gavel came down, he turned to Becca and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's us. We're the package deal." The crowd applauded, but Becca saw Victoria's face go white with fury. Outside the gala, paparazzi were waiting, and they photographed everything. Julian's hand on Becca's back. The way he looked at her. The smile on her face that said maybe she did belong after all. The next morning, Becca woke to her phone exploding with notifications. The photos were everywhere. Society pages, business websites, headlines that read, "Tech billionaire's new romance," and "Julian Westbrook goes public with girlfriend." Emma was thrilled, texting heart emojis and congratulations. Natalie was horrified, leaving voicemails about dignity and appropriateness. Old friends who hadn't called in years suddenly wanted to catch up. But then an email came through that made Becca's stomach drop. From Julian's assistant. "Mr. Westbrook would like you to come to his office. Important matter to discuss." The formal tone was so different from how Julian usually communicated. Was this it? Was this where the fairy tale ended? Becca arrived at his office building in Midtown, and security escorted her to the penthouse suite. Julian was pacing when she walked in, running his hands through his hair, looking more stressed than she'd ever seen him. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice was strained. "About my children. If you want to know what Julian's about to reveal, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now. This is the moment everything shifts. Not subscribing means you're choosing to miss the most emotional revelation yet. Come on, don't be that person. Hit that button." Julian looked like he hadn't slept. That was the first thing Becca noticed when she walked into his office. His normally immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, tie loosened, hair mussed like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing because something about his expression told her she'd need to be on her feet for whatever was coming. "My children saw the photos," he said without preamble. "From the gala. They're everywhere. And Sophia and Marcus are furious." Becca felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face neutral. Julian continued, words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing this speech all night. His daughter Sophia was 28, his son Marcus was 25, and they both felt like their father had moved on too quickly. Never mind that Julian and Victoria had been divorced for 5 years. Never mind that their mother had remarried within 18 months. The children saw those photos of Julian looking at Becca like she hung the moon, and they called him to express their rage. They accused him of replacing their mother, of having a midlife crisis, of being manipulated by someone who obviously wanted his money. "They think I'm having a midlife crisis," Julian said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "They think you're a gold digger." He looked devastated. Becca knew he'd been working hard to rebuild his relationships with his kids, attending family dinners, making time for phone calls, trying to make up for years of absence. And now he felt like he was losing ground. He looked at Becca with something close to desperation. "They want to meet you. They want to prove to themselves that this isn't real. And I need you to help me show them it is." Becca agreed, even though terror was crawling up her spine like ice water. The meeting was set for Sunday brunch at Julian's penthouse in Tribeca. Emma offered to come for moral support, to stand beside her mother and show Julian's children what real family looked like, but Becca declined. This was hers to handle. This was the price of admission to Julian's world, and she couldn't hide behind her daughter. Sunday morning arrived too quickly. Becca dressed carefully in a modest navy dress and simple jewelry, wanting to look put together but not like she was trying too hard. She arrived at the penthouse 10 minutes early and immediately regretted not being late because Sophia and Marcus were already there. They stood in Julian's living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, and they looked like they belonged in the space in a way Becca knew she never would. Sophia was stunning, 28 with her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes, wearing a designer pantsuit that screamed success. Marcus was 25, dark-haired like Julian must have been in his youth, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Both were beautiful, educated, successful, and so clearly skeptical that Becca could feel it radiating off them like heat. Sophia didn't even wait for pleasantries. She looked at Becca and said with a smile that was pure ice, "Let's cut to the chase. How much do you want?" The question hit Becca like a physical blow. They assumed she was after money. Of course they did. Why else would someone like her be with someone like their father? Becca opened her mouth to respond, but Julian stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "Sophia, that's enough." But Becca put her hand on his arm, stopping him. She could fight her own battles. She'd been fighting them for 14 years. "I don't want your father's money," she said, keeping her voice calm, even though her heart was hammering. "I have my own jobs, my own apartment, my own life. I was fine before I met him, and I'll be fine regardless of what happens between us." Marcus sneered, and the expression was so ugly on his young face that Becca almost felt sorry for him. "2 jobs? Please. You saw an opportunity and took it. Can't really blame you. Not everyone gets a chance at a billionaire." Sophia moved closer, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown. "Our father is vulnerable. He's lonely. He spent 5 years trying to fix what he broke with our family. And you're taking advantage of that. You're using his guilt and his loneliness to secure your future." Becca felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce, but she kept her composure because losing her temper would only prove their point. "Your father isn't vulnerable," she said quietly. "He's one of the strongest men I've ever met, and I'm not taking advantage. I'm just finally letting myself be happy after 14 years of surviving." But Sophia wasn't done. She moved even closer, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost sympathetic but was really just cruel. "Let's be honest here. You're 48 years old. You're a waitress and an administrative assistant. You have nothing to offer him. Nothing he can't get from 1,000 other women who are younger, more successful, more his speed." She paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "My mother is a successful psychiatrist. She built a real career. She has accomplishments. What have you done?" The words cut deeper than anything Victoria had said at the gala because they voiced every insecurity Becca had been carrying. She saw Julian's face go dark, saw him start to move, heard him say, "That's enough. Both of you." But Becca stopped him again because she needed to answer this herself. She needed these kids to hear her story not from their father but from her own mouth. She looked directly at Sophia and Marcus, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "You're right. I haven't built a billion-dollar company or a prestigious career. I was 19 when I got pregnant. I dropped out of college to have my daughter. I was married to her father for 15 years before he died of a heart attack in a parking lot, leaving me with $47,000 in debt and a 12-year-old child to raise alone." She saw Marcus shift uncomfortably, but she didn't stop. "I worked 2 jobs for 14 years. I missed school plays and parent-teacher conferences, and every milestone that mattered because I was keeping us fed and housed. I built a daughter who's kind and educated and loved. That's my legacy. That's what I've done." She turned her gaze to Julian, then back to his children. "And your father? He sees me because I see him. Not his money, not his power, not his ability to solve my problems. Just him, the man underneath all of it. Can you say the same?" The room fell into silence, so complete that Becca could hear her own heartbeat. Marcus looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight and staring at the floor. Sophia's face was unmoved, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been uncertainty. Then Julian took Becca's hand, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and certain. "I asked you here to meet Becca because I love her, and I'm going to marry her." Becca's head snapped toward him. What? This wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal. This wasn't romantic or planned, or any of the things she dreamed about when she was young and still believed in fairy tales. Sophia's face went white, then red. "You can't be serious." But Julian wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at Becca. And then, while his children watched in horror, he knelt down on one knee and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I've been carrying this ring for 2 weeks," he said, "waiting for the right moment. I'm sorry this was the moment, but I meant every word." He opened the box to reveal a 3-carat diamond in a vintage setting, the kind of ring that belonged in old movies and romance novels. "Rebecca Hartley, will you marry me?" Becca stared at the ring, at Julian kneeling in front of her, at Sophia and Marcus frozen in shock. Her mind raced through 100 thoughts at once. This was too fast, too public, too complicated. His children hated her. His ex-wife would make her life hell. She was 48 years old and terrified and completely unprepared for this moment. But her heart knew the answer, even if her head was screaming caution. She opened her mouth and heard herself say, "I need time." Julian's face fell. Sophia made a sound that was almost triumphant. "This is moving so fast," Becca continued, her voice shaking now. "Your children hate me. Your ex-wife will make my life hell. I need to think." Julian stood slowly, his knees cracking, and closed the ring box. But he nodded, and his voice was gentle even though she could see the hurt in his eyes. "I understand. Take all the time you need." Sophia stormed out without another word, her heels clicking in angry rhythm. Marcus followed after an awkward pause, throwing one last look at Becca that she couldn't quite read. And then she and Julian were alone in that enormous penthouse with its river views and its crushing silence. Becca was shaking. Julian reached for her, but she stepped back. "I should go," she said. "I need to think." She left him standing there with his ring box and his broken expression, and as she rode the elevator down 60 floors, she wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if saying yes would have been the mistake. She didn't know anymore. She didn't know anything except that she was 48 years old and terrified and completely, utterly lost. Pause. If you think Becca should say yes, comment yes below. If you think she's right to wait, comment wait. And if you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller yet, what are you even doing? This story is about to go places you can't imagine. Days passed, then a week, then 10 days. Becca and Julian didn't speak. She'd left his penthouse with the image of his face burned into her memory, that look of hurt and confusion and resignation. And now she couldn't escape it. She lay awake at night staring at her ceiling, drowning in doubt that felt like quicksand. Did she love Julian? Or did she love the idea of being saved? Was she being smart by protecting herself? Or was she self-sabotaging the best thing that had happened to her in 14 years? The questions circled her mind like vultures, and she had no answers. Only fear. Emma called every day, and her frustration was palpable even through the phone. Mom, you spend your whole life putting everyone else first. Let someone put you first for once. Let yourself be happy. But then Natalie would call, and her voice would drip with concern that felt more like poison. He'll tire of you eventually. Rich men always do. You're a novelty right now, the working-class Cinderella. But eventually, he'll want someone from his own world. Someone who fits. And where will that leave you? The words burrowed under Becca's skin and nested there, feeding on every insecurity she'd ever had. She returned to work, both jobs, and they felt suffocating in a way they never had before. The administrative office with its fluorescent lights and mindless filing. The restaurant with its demanding customers and aching feet. She saw her life clearly for the first time in years, saw it as an endless cycle of survival with no joy, no color, no possibility. And the worst part was the invisibility. At the restaurant, customers treated her dismissively, snapping fingers for refills, talking over her like she wasn't even there. She was invisible again. Julian had made her feel seen, valued, like she was someone who mattered. He'd made her feel possible, like there were still chapters of her life left to write. But fear paralyzed her. What if Natalie was right? What if she was just temporary? What if she said yes and gave him everything only to have him realize she wasn't enough? What if loving him meant losing herself all over again? A week passed, the longest week of her life. Every day she almost called him. Every night she stared at her phone and typed messages she never sent. And every morning she woke up more exhausted than the night before. Then Julian called. His name on her phone screen made her heart stop. She answered with shaking hands. "I miss you," he said without preamble. "But I won't pressure you. I just wanted you to know." His voice was rough, tired, and it broke something in Becca's chest. "I miss you too," she whispered, and realized it was the most honest thing she'd said in days. They agreed to meet for coffee. Neutral territory. A small cafe in the West Village where nobody knew them, and they could just be two people trying to figure out if they were making a terrible mistake or the best decision of their lives. When Becca arrived, Julian was already there, and he looked as exhausted as she felt. Dark circles under his eyes. Hair not quite as perfectly styled. They sat across from each other with coffee neither of them drank, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julian said something that changed everything. "Sophia called me. She apologized. Marcus, too." Becca looked up sharply. Julian continued, his voice careful. "They realized their anger was misdirected. They're not really angry at you. They're angry at me. At the divorce. At all the years I wasn't there. They're taking it out on you because you represent change. Because seeing me happy with someone who isn't their mother forces them to accept that their family isn't getting back together." He paused, met her eyes. "They want to try again. Meet you properly. Without the accusations and the cruelty. They want a chance to actually know you." Becca felt something loosen in her chest, but the fear was still there, coiled tight. She shared her own truth, the one that had been keeping her awake. "It's not about your children, or your money, or your lifestyle. I'm scared of losing myself again." Julian leaned forward, listening. "I disappeared into Marcus when I was 19. Then I disappeared into being Emma's mother. Then into survival mode. I don't know who I am outside of those roles. And what if I disappear into being Julian Westbrook's wife? What if I lose myself again and wake up in 10 years with no idea who I am?" The words came out in a rush, raw and honest. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that shocked her. "Then don't disappear. Marry me, but stay yourself." Becca started to protest, but he held up a hand. "I'm serious. Keep working if it fulfills you. Quit if it doesn't. Go back to school if you want that teaching degree. Write that book you mentioned. Travel alone if you need space to think. I don't want a trophy wife or an assistant or someone who makes me the center of their universe." His gray eyes were intense, certain. "I want a partner who challenges me, who has her own dreams and goals and identity, who chooses me every day not because she needs me, but because she wants me. I spent my first marriage with someone who defined herself by my success, and it destroyed us both. I won't make that mistake again." Becca stared at him and realized this was different. Julian wasn't asking her to change or mold herself into what he needed. He was asking her to stay exactly who she was and build a life alongside him, not inside him. The difference felt seismic. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you." Julian's face transformed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out that velvet box he'd been carrying, and slid the ring onto her finger. Perfect fit, like it had been made for her. They stood at the same time and embraced, and Becca felt something that had been frozen in her chest for 14 years finally start to thaw. But the moment shattered when her phone rang. Emma's name on the screen. Becca almost ignored it, but something in her gut said answer. "Mom." Emma's voice was wrecked with tears. "Something's wrong. I need you." Becca's entire body went cold. "What happened?" Emma was crying so hard she could barely speak. David's startup company had gone bankrupt. The investors had pulled out overnight. They were losing everything. The apartment, the savings, everything they built together in their year of marriage. And there was more. Emma had just found out she was pregnant. 8 weeks. She'd been planning to surprise David, to make it special, but now she was terrified. They had 2 months before eviction. 2 months to figure out how to survive with a baby on the way and no income and no safety net. Becca's protective instinct roared to life like a sleeping dragon. "I'm coming. Right now. Don't move." She pulled away from Julian, her engagement ring still warm on her finger. "I have to go. Emma needs me." She drove to Emma's apartment in Brooklyn, breaking probably 6 traffic laws, and found her daughter curled on the couch, hysterical. David was there too, looking ashamed and broken. He explained through apologies. The startup had seemed solid. They'd had investors, contracts, a real business plan. But one major client pulled out, and it started a domino effect. Investors panicked. The board dissolved the company. David was out of work with no severance and no prospects. They had 2 months before they lost the apartment. Becca's mind immediately started calculating. Her savings account had maybe $8,000. With her 2 jobs, she could probably cover Emma's rent for those 2 months. Maybe 3 if she picked up extra shifts. But then what? Then David would need to find work, and Emma would be showing, and they'd have hospital bills and baby expenses. The math was impossible. And then another thought crept in, one that made her stomach twist. She had Julian now. Julian, who just put a 3-carat diamond on her finger. Julian, who could solve this problem with the financial equivalent of pocket change. He could help Emma and David, could save them from this nightmare. But before Becca could even voice the thought, Emma looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and said, "Mom, no. I know what you're thinking. We can't ask him for money. I won't be a charity case. I won't be the reason everyone says you married him." And Becca faced an impossible choice. Let her daughter struggle and potentially lose everything while she stood by with access to unlimited resources. Or accept help from her fiancé and prove every cruel person right. Prove that she was with Julian for his money. Prove that she was exactly what Sophia and Marcus and Victoria and Natalie said she was. Her daughter was pregnant and terrified. Her future grandchild's security was at stake. And Becca had to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller if you want to see how Becca handles this impossible situation. And if you're not subscribing, drop a comment telling me why you're okay missing the most powerful choice she'll ever make. I'll wait, but this story won't. Becca spent the night at Emma's apartment. She held her daughter while Emma cried, while David paced the small living room looking like a man who just watched his entire future collapse. David kept apologizing, over and over, like a broken record. He felt like he'd failed as a provider, like he'd let Emma down in the worst possible way. Emma was terrified, not just about the money, though that was crushing enough. She was scared about being a first-time mother with no financial security, about bringing a baby into chaos, about repeating the cycle of struggle that had defined her own childhood. Becca held Emma close and said the words that mothers say when they have no answers but need to provide comfort anyway. We've survived worse. We'll survive this. But inside, Becca was calculating with the cold precision of someone who'd been doing crisis math for 14 years. Her savings account had $8,000. She could cover 2 months of Emma's rent, maybe 3 if she was careful. She could pick up a third job, maybe weekend shift somewhere, though the thought made her entire body ache with exhaustion. And underneath all of that was the truth she couldn't escape. She was engaged to a billionaire who could solve this problem instantly. Julian could write a check that would mean nothing to him and everything to Emma. But taking that money felt like proving everyone right. Like admitting she was exactly what they all said she was. The next morning, Becca returned to her own apartment as the sun was coming up, exhausted and hollow. She found Julian waiting outside her building, sitting on the steps with 2 cups of coffee and a bag from the bakery on the corner. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "Emma called me," he said before Becca could even process her surprise at seeing him. "Last night, after you left, she told me what happened." Becca felt her entire body tense. What had Emma said? Had her daughter asked Julian for money behind her back? Julian must have seen the panic on her face because he held up a hand. "She asked me not to tell you," she called, "but I'm telling you anyway because we're done with secrets." He handed her a coffee, and Becca took it with numb fingers. "She said you'd try to handle this alone, that you'd never ask for help. She also said you'd probably try to break our engagement rather than feel indebted to me." Becca felt tears prick her eyes because her daughter knew her too well. Knew exactly how her mother's mind worked, knew the patterns of survival and pride that had defined their entire lives. "I can't take your money, Julian," Becca said quietly. "Not for this. Not for Emma." Julian looked at her with an expression that was patient and sad and understanding all at once. "Why not?" he asked simply. "We're family now. Family helps family." The words broke something in Becca, and suddenly she was crying on the steps of her apartment building at 6 in the morning, trying to explain fear that ran so deep it felt like it was written into her bones. "My whole life, I've survived on my own terms. I've never owed anyone anything. I've never been bought or owned or controlled. If I take your money, I lose that. I lose the one thing I've managed to keep through everything else." Julian set down his coffee and took her hands, and his voice was gentle but firm. "Let me tell you a story. When I was 25, I was building my company. We were on the verge of bankruptcy. I had nothing. No savings, no backup plan, just this idea and a lot of debt." Becca listened through her tears. "A friend of mine, another engineer, gave me a loan. $100,000. No contract. No collateral. Just trust. He said to me, 'You'll pay me back someday, or you'll help someone else when they need it. Either way, it's just money.'" Julian's eyes were steady on hers. "That loan saved my company. Saved my life. And when we succeeded, I paid him back tenfold. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the loan wasn't charity. It was an investment in me. In my potential. Let me invest in our family, Becca. Let me help Emma and David not because you need to be saved, but because we're building something together." Becca wrestled with herself, with pride and practicality warring in her chest. Emma was pregnant. Emma was stressed and vulnerable and scared. Was Becca's pride really worth her daughter's suffering? Was protecting her own ego more important than her grandchild's security? The answer was obvious, even if it hurt to admit. "Okay," she said finally, "but it's a loan. Emma and David will pay you back when they can. No gifts. No charity. They need to feel like they earned their way out of this." Julian smiled, and it was warm and real. "Deal. Though I have to say, I think David would make an excellent employee at my company. We're always looking for good people, and someone who can build a startup from scratch has skills we need." Becca looked at him sharply. "Is that pity hiring?" Julian's expression turned serious. "No. It's recognizing talent. He built something that almost worked. He just had bad timing and worse investors. That's not a character flaw. That's life. Give him a real opportunity, and I think he'll prove himself. Becca saw the wisdom in this. It wasn't a handout. It was a chance. A real job with real responsibilities and a salary that David would earn. That was different from charity. That was respect. Julian helped David get a position at his tech company. Not in the mailroom or some made-up role, but as a project manager with actual responsibilities. Emma and David's crisis averted almost overnight. They kept their apartment, started preparing for the baby with cautious optimism instead of terror. Emma hugged her mother, so tight Becca could barely breathe, and whispered, "Mom, you found a good one. Don't let him go." And Becca realized something profound. Julian hadn't made her weak. He'd made their family stronger. There was a difference between being saved and being supported, and she was finally learning what that difference felt like. Wedding planning began in earnest. Small and intimate, just the people who mattered. But before they could get too far into planning, Sophia and Marcus requested another meeting. Becca's stomach dropped when Julian told her, but he quickly added that the tone was different this time. They wanted to apologize. Properly. They asked to meet Becca alone, without Julian there. Just the three of them at a neutral restaurant in Manhattan. Becca arrived at the restaurant with her heart in her throat, expecting another confrontation. But Sophia and Marcus were different. Softer somehow. They stood when she approached the table, and Sophia spoke first. "We were wrong about you. Dad told us what you did for your daughter. How you've lived. What you've sacrificed." Her voice wasn't cold this time. It was human. Marcus added, his voice quiet, "You're not after his money. You're like him. Like Dad was before the success changed things. Before the money made everything complicated." They sat, and for the next 2 hours, Sophia and Marcus shared stories that Becca had never heard. Stories about their father before the divorce. Driven and ambitious, and so focused on building his empire that he forgot to be present for the people who loved him. They told her about missed birthdays and forgotten promises, and the slow erosion of a family that nobody knew how to save. "We blamed Mom for the divorce," Sophia admitted. "It was easier than blaming Dad, but it was his absence that killed the marriage. Mom just had the courage to walk away." Becca listened and understood their pain in a way she hadn't before. These weren't spoiled, rich kids being cruel. These were wounded children in adult bodies, trying to protect themselves from more hurt. Finally, Sophia looked at Becca with eyes that were suspiciously bright and asked, "Can we start over? Really try to be family?" And Becca understood what she was signing up for. This wasn't just marrying Julian. It was inheriting a broken family that needed healing. It was choosing to be part of something messy and complicated and real. She reached across the table and took Sophia's hand, then Marcus's. "Yes," she said. "Let's be family. If you believe in second chances, in healing, in family that chooses each other, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller now. Because what happens at the wedding will prove that love can rebuild what was broken." Not subscribed yet? Come tell me in comments why you're choosing to miss the most beautiful wedding you'll ever hear about. 6 months passed in a blur of wedding planning and baby preparations and the slow, careful work of building a family from broken pieces. And then suddenly it was the day. A small, intimate wedding at an estate in upstate New York. Not the society spectacle that people probably expected from Julian Westbrook, but something quieter and more real. 50 people. Just the ones who mattered. Emma was 7 months pregnant, glowing in a soft blue dress that accommodated her growing belly, standing as matron of honor with one hand protectively over her stomach. Rick, Julian's brother, stood as best man, grinning like he'd won something. And here was the thing that made Becca's heart swell. Sophia and Marcus were both in the wedding party. Not grudgingly, not out of obligation, but with real smiles on their faces, smiles that reached their eyes and spoke of healing that was slow but genuine. Even Natalie was there, sitting in the 3rd row. And yes, she'd spent weeks trying to talk Becca out of this wedding, citing every possible reason why it was too fast, too risky, too foolish. But she'd shown up anyway, and Becca chose to see that as progress. The ceremony was in the garden at sunset, and the light was golden and perfect, the kind of light that made everything look like a painting. A string quartet played something classical and beautiful, and roses climbed trellises that framed the ceremony space like they'd been planted specifically for this moment. Becca stood at the entrance to the garden, in a simple but elegant wedding dress. Not trying to be 25 again. Not pretending she was something she wasn't. Just embracing 48 with all its scars and strength and hard-won wisdom. She'd chosen to walk down the aisle alone. Not because she didn't have people who would walk with her, but because this felt right. She'd been walking alone for so long that it felt honest to walk toward Julian on her own 2 feet, making this choice as a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. As she moved down the aisle, past the faces of people who'd watched her journey, she saw Julian waiting for her. And he was crying. This billionaire tech mogul with his silver hair and his expensive suit was standing at the altar with tears streaming down his face, not even trying to hide them. When she reached him, he whispered so only she could hear, "You're breathtaking." The ceremony was personal in a way that formal weddings rarely are. They'd written their own vows, and when Julian spoke first, his voice shook with emotion. "I spent 52 years building an empire but forgetting to build a home. I thought success meant money and power and proving I was worth something to a world that had overlooked me." He paused, looked directly at Becca. "You taught me that real strength isn't about any of that. It's about showing up, day after day, for the people you love, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise to show up for you, every day, in the ways that matter." Then it was Becca's turn, and her hands were shaking so badly that Emma had to steady her. "I spent 14 years being invisible. I convinced myself I didn't deserve to be seen, that I'd used up my chance at happiness, and the rest of my life was just about survival and sacrifice." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "You saw me anyway. Not as Marcus's widow. Not as Emma's mother. Not as someone who needed saving or fixing or charity. Just as me. Rebecca. A woman with dreams and fears and strength I'd forgotten I had." She took a breath, looked at Julian through her own tears. "I promise not to disappear into being your wife. To keep my voice. To be your partner, not your shadow. And I promise to help you reconnect with the children who love you, even when it's messy and hard. Because family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing each other and showing up even when showing up is the hardest thing in the world." The guests were crying. Emma was full-on sobbing, mascara running down her face. Even Sophia was wiping her eyes with a tissue that Marcus had handed her. They exchanged rings. Simple platinum bands that caught the sunset light. And when the officiant said, "You may kiss your bride," Julian pulled Becca close and kissed her like they were the only 2 people in the world. The reception was in the same garden, and as dinner was served and champagne flowed, the speeches began. Rick told stories about Julian as a young man, hungry and determined and sleeping on his office floor because he couldn't afford an apartment. Emma told a story that made Becca cry all over again, about a mother who worked 2 jobs but somehow never missed her college graduation, who showed up exhausted but present for every moment that really mattered. Then Sophia stood, and the entire reception tensed. But Sophia's face was soft open. "I was cruel to you," she said, looking directly at Becca. "I said terrible things that I can never take back. I was angry at my father, at my parents' divorce, at feeling abandoned for most of my childhood." Her voice wavered. "But you didn't let my cruelty break you. You showed grace when I showed none, patience when I had none to give, strength that I'm still learning to recognize." She paused, smiled through tears. "My father found someone who deserves him. And maybe, if we're lucky, we found a second chance at being a family." Marcus stood beside his sister and added simply, "Welcome to the family, Becca. We promise to do better." The first dance was to the same song that had played at Emma's wedding, the song that had brought Julian and Becca together on a dance floor 6 months ago when they were both still invisible to themselves. Now, as they swayed together as husband and wife, it felt like coming full circle. Julian pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you for taking a chance on us." Becca responded, "Thank you for seeing me." But mid-dance, Emma approached with David at her side, and Becca could tell immediately that something was wrong. Emma's face was tight with pain. "Mom," she said, "my water just broke." The wedding transformed into beautiful chaos. Julian's driver was summoned immediately to rush Emma and David to the hospital. The wedding party followed in a convoy of cars, still in their formal wear, nobody even thinking about staying for cake or more dancing because this was more important. The ceremony ended early, but nobody minded. They all understood that some moments matter more than tradition. At the hospital, they waited. Becca still in her wedding dress, Julian still in his tuxedo, holding hands in an uncomfortable waiting room chair. At midnight, Emma delivered a healthy baby girl. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect. They named her Rebecca Grace, after her grandmother and the grace that had brought this family together. Becca held her granddaughter for the first time with Julian by her side, and the weight of that tiny body felt like the weight of everything good she'd ever done in her life. Emma was exhausted but radiant. David was crying happy tears. And then Sophia and Marcus came into the hospital room, still in their wedding party clothes, and they approached the baby with reverence. They touched tiny hands with gentle fingers and looked at their father with expressions that said maybe they were finally starting to understand what family could be. Julian wrapped his arm around Becca and said quietly, "This is what I wanted. This right here. Family." Becca looked around at her daughter, her granddaughter, her husband, her stepchildren who were really trying. She thought about the woman she'd been at Emma's wedding, standing invisible at the edge of a dance floor, convinced her story was over. And she realized she wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was loved. She was home. If you have tears in your eyes right now, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. Because this channel is full of stories about people who refused to give up, who found love when they stopped looking, who proved it's never too late. And if you're not subscribed, come explain in comments why you're choosing to miss stories that might change your life. I'll be waiting, but these stories won't wait forever. 6 months after the wedding, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Becca sat in what used to be Julian's home office but was now theirs. Shared space, shared life. She had textbooks spread across half the massive desk, while Julian was on a conference call on the other half, both of them working in comfortable silence that felt like intimacy. Becca was enrolled in an online graduate program, finally getting that teaching credential she'd abandoned 26 years ago when Emma was born. She was student teaching at a local high school 3 days a week, and right now she was grading papers with a red pen, making notes and margins about thesis statements and evidence. Julian glanced over at her work, caught her eye, and smiled before returning to his call about infrastructure upgrades or server capacity or something technical that Becca still didn't fully understand. Baby Grace was 6 months old now, and Emma and David brought her over twice a week for dinner and grandparent time. David was thriving at Julian's company, already promoted once, proving he had the skills Julian had recognized. Life was full but balanced in a way Becca had never experienced before. She'd quit the restaurant job because the late nights were interfering with her student teaching, but she'd kept the part-time administrative work. Not because she needed the money anymore. She didn't, but because she wanted the autonomy, wanted to earn something that was hers. Julian understood without her having to explain. He'd never once pressured her to quit, never suggested she should just stay home and enjoy his wealth. He got it. That was the difference. Sophia stopped by for lunch that day, and the relationship between them had transformed into something real. Not forced, not performative, actually real. They sat in the kitchen eating salads and talking about Sophia's therapy sessions, about her healing relationship with her father, about the work she was doing to unpack years of resentment. Sophia set down her fork and said something that made Becca's chest ache. "I was jealous of you. I know I said I was protecting Dad, but really I was jealous. You got a version of him we never had. Present, attentive, willing to prioritize the relationship over work." Her voice cracked. "He's different with you than he ever was with us." Becca could have let that comment sit, could have accepted the compliment and moved on. But she chose honesty instead. He learned from his mistakes. Pain taught him. You and Marcus taught him. Sophia looked up sharply. Your anger forced him to look at himself, to really see what he'd lost and why. You didn't do anything wrong by being angry. You helped him change. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for not giving up on us. Most people would have walked away. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, and he wasn't alone. He brought his new girlfriend, a bright-eyed grad student named Amy, to meet his stepmom. The word felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Stepmom. This blended family was working. Slowly, with setbacks and uncomfortable moments, but really working. That afternoon, Becca got an email that made her hands shake. Her first essay had been accepted for publication in a literary magazine. She'd written it months ago, during one of those sleepless nights when she couldn't stop thinking about her journey. It was about loss and survival and finding love after 40 when you thought your story was finished. The essay was raw and honest and vulnerable in ways that terrified her. But there it was, published, real. Julian found her crying in the office and immediately thought something was wrong. But when she showed him the email and then pulled up the published piece on her laptop, he read it with tears streaming down his face. "This is beautiful," he said when he finished. "You're finding your voice." And Becca realized something profound. She wasn't invisible anymore. But she also hadn't disappeared into being Julian's wife. She was both. All of it. Wife, mother, grandmother, student, writer, teacher. Multifaceted. Complete. Seen. Later that evening, Julian told her about something he'd done without telling her. He'd established a scholarship in her name. The Rebecca Hartley Scholarship for Non-Traditional Students. It would help single parents complete their education, give them the chance Becca never had when she was young. "Your story matters," Julian said. "Your survival matters. Let's help other people survive too." Becca cried again, the good kind of crying that felt like release and gratitude and wonder all mixed together. Even Natalie visited that week, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. She sat stiffly on the couch in the living room and said words that clearly cost her something. "I judged you. I was cruel. I thought you'd fail, and honestly, part of me wanted you to fail because it would prove I was right." She paused, looked directly at Becca. "But you didn't fail. You built something real." Becca was gracious because she understood her sister better now. "You were scared for me. I understand that. You didn't want to watch me get hurt again." But Natalie shook her head. "It wasn't just that. I was jealous. You lost everything and rebuilt your entire life from scratch. I have everything I'm supposed to want, the house and the husband and the success, but I feel empty. You found something real, and I don't know how to do that." The sisters had a real conversation for the first time in years, maybe ever. The kind of conversation that doesn't fix everything but builds a bridge where there used to be a wall. Even toxic relationships can transform with honesty. That night, they had family dinner. 14 people around the table. Julian, Becca, Emma, David, baby Grace in her high chair making a mess with sweet potatoes, Sophia, Marcus and Amy, Rick's family including his wife and their 2 teenage kids. Loud. Chaotic. Imperfect. People talking over each other and laughing at inside jokes and passing dishes and wiping baby food off the table. This was family. Not the neat, picture-perfect version from magazines. The real kind. Chosen and blended and earned through showing up even when it was hard. Late that night, after everyone had left and the dishes were done and the house was quiet again, Becca and Julian stood on their balcony looking out at the city lights below. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From invisible widow standing at the edge of a dance floor to visible wife standing in her own life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking a chance on me?" Julian's response was immediate and fierce. "Never. You saved me as much as I saved you." Becca smiled and corrected him gently. "We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 survivors who'd found home in each other. Becca thought about the woman she'd been at Emma's wedding. 48 years old, invisible, convinced her life was over and the rest was just going through motions. Now she was 49, a student, a writer, a wife, a grandmother, a stepmother. Life hadn't ended at 40. It had just been waiting to begin. Julian took her hand, laced their fingers together. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Becca looked at him, at this man who'd seen her when she was invisible, who'd asked her to dance and changed everything. "I'm thinking that I spent so long being invisible, I forgot I could choose to be seen. That it's never too late to start over. That love isn't about age or status or worthiness. It's about showing up and being brave enough to let someone show up for you." Julian kissed her forehead, and his voice was soft with emotion. "Thank you for being brave." They stood there holding each other as the city sparkled below them, 2 people who'd found second chances when they stopped looking, who proved it's never too late, who chose to be seen. This is what Olivia the Storyteller is all about. Stories that prove you're never too old, too tired, too ordinary for magic. If this story touched your heart, subscribe right now. We post stories like this every week. Stories about people who refuse to give up, who found love, joy, purpose when they stopped looking, who prove that your story isn't over until you say it is. And if you're still not subscribed, I honestly don't understand. Come tell me why in the comments. I genuinely want to know why you're choosing to miss out on stories that could change how you see yourself, your life, your possibilities. What are you waiting for? Your own story isn't over yet. Neither is ours. Subscribe, join us, and let's prove together that it's never too late to be seen.